Captain Jake Sullivan walked through the massive doors of the Galactic Council chambers with his head held high, even though he knew what was coming would not be pleasant. The aliens sitting on their elevated platforms looked down at him with expressions that clearly showed they thought humans were nothing special. Some of them were twice his height, and others had bodies made of materials he could barely understand. But Jake had learned long ago not to show fear in front of beings who expected him to be afraid. King Tharvos of the Zentarai Empire rose from his seat, and the chamber fell silent. His reptilian body was covered in scales that glowed with different colors, and his eyes were cold as he looked at Jake. The king had called this meeting to reward Jake for his service in the Outer Rim conflict, where human soldiers had fought alongside alien forces for 3 long years. Everyone in the chamber knew that humans had done most of the dangerous work, while the other species took the glory, but no one was going to say that out loud. The king gestured toward a sealed door at the side of the chamber, and it opened slowly. A young woman stepped out, and Jake could see immediately that she was the king's daughter. Princess Kira had violet-colored eyes and dark hair that fell past her shoulders. She wore simple clothing, unlike the elaborate armor her father displayed, and she kept her eyes down as she walked toward the center of the room. Jake noticed something, though, that others might have missed. Her hands were not trembling with shame but were clenched into fists of anger. King Tharvos began speaking in a voice that carried across the entire chamber. He explained that his daughter was a disappointment to the Zentarai Empire because she cared more about science and learning than about conquest and war. She had refused to lead armies, and instead spent her time in libraries studying ancient texts and conducting experiments. The other members of the royal family were warriors who brought glory to their people, but Kira brought only embarrassment. Therefore, the king had decided to give her away as a reward to the human captain who had served the council faithfully. The chamber erupted with laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. Counselor Vrex, whose body was made of living crystal, flickered with light patterns that other aliens understood as amusement. The message was clear to everyone present. Humans were so insignificant that giving them the unwanted daughter of a king was considered an appropriate reward. It was meant to be an insult, wrapped in the appearance of honor. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had spent 3 years being treated as inferior by these beings, and he had learned to control his reactions. He looked at Princess Kira and saw that she was watching him now, with those intelligent violet eyes. There was a question in her gaze, as if she was trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Jake made his decision in that moment, not because he wanted to accept an insult, but because he saw an opportunity that none of these laughing aliens could comprehend. He stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice that cut through the laughter. He said that he accepted the king's generous offer and would take Princess Kira as his wife. The laughter grew even louder because the aliens thought he was either stupid or desperate. King Tharvos smiled with satisfaction, thinking he had successfully humiliated both his daughter and the human race at the same time. The ceremony was brief and conducted with barely concealed mockery. Kira was brought to stand beside Jake, and an official read out the terms of the arrangement in a bored voice. As a married couple, they would be expected to leave the council chambers immediately and return to human space. The king made it clear that Kira was no longer welcome in the Zentarai Empire, and that she had brought shame to her family name. When the ceremony ended and the officials dismissed them, Jake and Kira walked out of the chamber together in silence. The guards led them through long hallways toward the docking bay, where Jake's ship was waiting. Kira had been allowed to bring only a small bag of personal belongings because her father wanted to erase every trace of her from his empire. Once they were far enough from the main chamber that no one could overhear them, Kira spoke for the first time. She asked Jake why he had accepted the arrangement when he could have refused and saved himself the humiliation. Her voice was soft, but there was strength in it that surprised him. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. He told her the truth, which was that he saw an opportunity where others saw only insult. He had studied every species in the council and learned their weaknesses and their fears. He knew that giving away a royal daughter, even an unwanted one, was a political move that could be turned to their advantage. Kira studied his face for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had shown in years. She told him that she had also seen an opportunity, which was why she had not fought harder against her father's decision. She explained that she knew things about the Council and its members that could be valuable to someone who was willing to use that information. She had access to restricted data and knowledge of political secrets that the other species thought were safely hidden. They reached the docking bay where Jake's ship was waiting. The vessel was called Horizon Runner, and it was small compared to the massive warships of the Council species, but it was fast and well-maintained. The crew members were waiting at the airlock, and their faces showed confusion when they saw their captain arriving with an alien princess. Jake introduced Kira to his crew, including Lieutenant Commander Lisa Monroe, who was his second-in-command, and Pete Collins, who was the chief engineer. As the ship lifted off and left the Council station behind, Jake and Kira stood together on the bridge watching the stars streak past as they entered faster-than-light travel. The Council members thought they had played a joke on humanity by giving them an unwanted princess. What they did not understand was that they had just made a terrible mistake. They had given Jake Sullivan exactly what he needed to change the balance of power in the galaxy. They had given him someone who understood their weaknesses and who had every reason to want revenge against the system that had rejected her. Kira looked at Jake and spoke quietly so only he could hear. She told him that she had 47 languages memorized and knew the location of every restricted zone in Council space. She had studied their military tactics and their economic systems. She had spent her entire life being dismissed as worthless by people who underestimated her intelligence. Now she finally had a chance to show them how wrong they had been. Jake smiled and welcomed her to the crew of Horizon Runner. The real work was about to begin. The crew of Horizon Runner watched with growing amazement as Princess Kira transformed their cargo bay into something that looked like it belonged on a research station instead of a military vessel. She worked 18 hours a day, assembling equipment and setting up systems that made their own technology look primitive by comparison. Pete Collins spent most of his time following her around asking questions and taking notes because even though he was considered one of the best engineers in the human fleet, he felt like a student watching a master at work. Jake gave Kira complete freedom to do whatever she needed because he understood that her knowledge was more valuable than cargo space. Lisa Monroe was less certain about having an alien princess working unsupervised on their ship, but she kept her concerns to herself and watched carefully. After 2 weeks, Lisa had to admit that Kira was not just intelligent but also genuinely interested in helping them rather than sabotaging their systems. The breakthrough came on a quiet evening when Jake was reviewing supply reports in his quarters. Pete burst through the door without knocking, which was unusual enough that Jake knew something important had happened. Pete was breathing hard like he had run through the entire ship and his eyes were wide with excitement. He told Jake that he needed to come to the cargo bay immediately because Kira had discovered something that would change everything. Jake followed Pete through the corridors and found Kira standing in front of a massive holographic display that showed weapon schematics from dozens of different civilizations. She had been studying the defensive systems used by Council fleets and had found a pattern that no one else had noticed. Every species in the Council used energy-based shields to protect their ships, and these shields were extremely effective against the energy weapons that everyone else used. However, the shields had one critical weakness that had never mattered before. Kira explained that energy shields needed to refresh their power matrix every few microseconds to maintain their strength. During that brief refresh period, the shields were vulnerable to attack, but the window was so small that conventional energy weapons could not exploit it. Every civilization had moved away from physical projectile weapons centuries ago because energy weapons were more efficient and easier to maintain. The Council had become so confident in their shield technology that they had stopped looking for weaknesses in the system. Jake understood immediately what Kira was suggesting. Humans still used railguns and kinetic weapons because their energy weapon technology was not as advanced as other species. What everyone had seen as a sign of human primitiveness was actually an advantage that no one had recognized. Kinetic projectiles traveled fast enough to slip through the shield refresh window and strike the hull directly. The Council fleets were vulnerable to the very weapons they had mocked as outdated. Pete started laughing because he realized that the aliens had been so busy feeling superior that they had created a blind spot in their defenses. Kira smiled and said that this was exactly the kind of arrogance that had made her hate the Council system. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they could not imagine anyone finding a way to beat them. Over the following weeks, Jake and Kira worked together to develop tactics that would maximize this advantage. They studied Council fleet formations and identified the best ways to approach enemy ships. Kira provided detailed information about command structures and communication protocols, while Jake contributed his military experience and understanding of human capabilities. Lisa joined their planning sessions and added her own insights about ship handling and combat maneuvers. The partnership between Jake and Kira grew stronger as they worked together. She appreciated that he treated her as an equal and valued her knowledge instead of dismissing her opinions. He recognized that she understood aspects of galactic politics and technology that would take humans decades to learn on their own. They spent long hours talking about strategy and discussing possible scenarios, until the rest of the crew started making jokes about them being inseparable. News from Earth brought concerning reports that made their work more urgent. Commander Helen Torres sent encrypted messages from the orbital station around Earth, describing new developments in Council politics. The Council had begun imposing trade restrictions on human colonies and claiming transit rights through space that humans considered their territory. Ships were being stopped and searched without proper authorization, and human merchants were being harassed at Council-controlled stations. Jake called a meeting with his senior officers to discuss the situation. Lisa argued that the Council was testing humanity to see if they would resist or simply accept the new restrictions. Pete pointed out that if humans did nothing, then the Council would continue pushing until they controlled everything. Kira explained that this was a standard tactic used by the Council to absorb smaller civilizations. They would gradually increase pressure until the target species either submitted or made a mistake that justified military action. Jake asked Kira what would change the Council's approach and make them take humanity seriously. She thought for a moment before answering that the Council respected only two things, which were power and access to resources they could not obtain themselves. Humans did not have enough military power to threaten the Council directly, but they might be able to gain access to something the Council wanted desperately. She told them about the Forbidden Zones, which were areas of space that the Council had declared off-limits 200 years ago. These zones contained ancient precursor technology from a civilization that had existed millions of years before any current species. The Council had banned exploration of these zones after an incident that killed thousands of people. But the real reason was that they wanted to control access to precursor technology. If humans could reach a forbidden zone and retrieve working precursor devices, then the Council would have to negotiate with them as equals. Jake asked if Kira knew where these forbidden zones were located. She smiled and said that she had memorized every restricted coordinate in her father's personal archives. King Tharvos had kept detailed records of precursor sites because he believed that someday his empire would be strong enough to claim them. He had never imagined that his dismissed daughter would use that information against him. The plan was dangerous because entering a forbidden zone would give the Council an excuse to attack human forces directly. However, doing nothing meant accepting slow absorption into the Council system. Jake made his decision and ordered Pete to plot a course for the nearest forbidden zone. Lisa argued that they should inform Earth Command first, but Jake said that official approval would take too long and might be denied. This was something they needed to do quickly before the Council realized what was happening. Kira worked with Pete to prepare the ship for the journey. She explained that the forbidden zones were protected by automated defense systems left behind by multiple civilizations. These systems were old but still functional, and they would attack any ship that approached without proper authorization codes. Fortunately, Kira had found fragments of those codes in her father's archives, and she believed she could modify them to work with a human ship. As Horizon Runner changed course toward the Forbidden Zone, Jake stood on the bridge watching the stars and thinking about what they were about to attempt. He knew that if they succeeded, then humanity would gain the technology and respect they needed to stand equal with the Council. If they failed, then they would likely die in space and Earth would lose one of its few experienced captains. Kira came to stand beside him and told him that she believed in what they were doing. She had spent her whole life watching the Council crush smaller civilizations, and she wanted to help build something different. Jake told her that he was glad she had ended up on his ship even though the circumstances had been meant as an insult. Kira laughed and said that sometimes the best outcomes came from situations that seemed terrible at first. They both understood that they were heading toward a confrontation with the most powerful force in the galaxy, but neither of them was afraid. They had found something rare, which was a partnership based on mutual respect and a shared desire to change an unjust system. The Forbidden Zone in Sector 47 appeared on their sensors as a dense asteroid field that seemed to have no particular significance until they got closer and saw the warning beacons. Hundreds of automated platforms floated in a perimeter around the asteroids, broadcasting warnings in every known language. The message was simple and clear, which was that any ship entering this zone would be destroyed without further warning. The platforms were old, but their weapon systems were still active, and Jake counted at least 30 different types of defense systems from 8 different civilizations. Pete sat at his console, running calculations and muttering under his breath about the impossibility of what they were attempting. The defense grid was designed to destroy anything that approached, and the firing solutions overlapped so perfectly that there was no safe path through. Lisa stood behind him, checking his work, and her face showed the same concern. They both looked at Kira, who was seated at a temporary station she had set up with her own equipment. Kira's fingers moved across holographic controls as she accessed the navigation codes she had decrypted from her father's database. She had explained that King Tharvos kept these codes as insurance, in case he ever needed to access the Forbidden Zones himself. The codes were ancient and written in languages that no longer existed, but Kira had spent years studying precursor texts, and she understood enough to make the translations. She activated the transmission sequence and sent the codes toward the defense platforms. For several long seconds nothing happened, and Jake wondered if they were about to be blown apart by automated weapons that had been waiting 2 centuries to kill something. Then the defense platforms began powering down one by one, and a narrow corridor opened through the perimeter. Pete let out a breath he had been holding, and Lisa gripped the edge of her console. Kira nodded with satisfaction and told Jake that they had approximately 30 minutes before the platforms would reset and close the corridor again. Jake ordered Pete to take them through at maximum safe speed. Horizon Runner moved forward, carefully navigating between the dormant weapons platforms. The asteroids were larger than they appeared from a distance, and some of them had structures built into their surfaces. Ancient docking ports and sensor arrays jutted from the rock, indicating that this place had once been heavily inhabited. The ship's sensors picked up energy readings deep within the asteroid field, and Kira directed them toward the strongest signal. What they found took everyone's breath away. A massive structure hung in space between 3 large asteroids, looking like a metal flower, with petals that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The hull was made of a material that seemed to shift colors as they approached, and the design was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. This was genuine precursor architecture, and it made every other structure in the galaxy look crude by comparison. Kira guided them to a docking port that her research suggested was a maintenance entrance rather than a main gate. She explained that main entrances would likely have additional security systems, while maintenance ports were designed for quick access. The docking procedure was surprisingly smooth, and the ancient systems seemed to recognize their approach codes. When they heard the clamps engage and seal around their airlock, Jake ordered everyone to suit up before they explored the station. The interior of the precursor facility was dark, until they stepped inside, and then lights activated automatically along the corridors. The walls were smooth and seamless, without any visible joints or fasteners. Lisa commented that the construction technology alone was worth the trip because humans had nothing that could create spaces like this. They moved carefully through the corridors, following Kira, who seemed to know where she was going based on her understanding of precursor design principles. They entered a massive chamber that appeared to be a central control room or archive. Holographic displays activated as they approached, showing text and images in languages that had been dead for millions of years. Kira stepped up to the main console and began interacting with the controls. Her face showed intense concentration as she worked, and then suddenly her eyes went wide with shock. She turned to Jake and told him something that changed everything they thought they knew about galactic history. The Zentarai royal line was not just another species, but rather descended from the precursors themselves through genetic engineering experiments. The facility recognized Kira's DNA and had granted her full access to systems that would have remained locked for anyone else. This explained why King Tharvos had kept detailed records of precursor sites and why he guarded that information so carefully. He knew that his family had a connection to the ancient civilization, but he had never told anyone, because it would have made him vulnerable to those who wanted that power for themselves. Kira worked quickly, downloading everything she could access from the ancient archives. The data included technology blueprints for devices that were centuries beyond anything the Council possessed. Power generation systems that could create almost unlimited energy from quantum fluctuations. Weapons that could disrupt space itself, making shields and armor irrelevant. Medicine that could extend lifespans and cure diseases that were currently considered fatal. The precursors had achieved a level of advancement that made current galactic civilization look primitive. Pete and Lisa helped gather physical data storage devices that were scattered throughout the facility. The precursors had apparently believed in multiple backup systems, and there were crystal matrices containing information stored in every major room. Pete estimated that they had enough raw data to keep Earth scientists busy for decades trying to understand and implement everything. Jake explored deeper into the facility with 2 crew members, while Kira continued her work at the main console. They found chambers that appeared to be living quarters, and others that looked like laboratories. In one room, Jake discovered something disturbing, which was a historical archive showing the fall of precursor civilization. The images and text told a story of a society that had achieved incredible technological advancement, but had failed to adapt their political and social systems to match their capabilities. The precursors had created a rigid hierarchy, where a small number of families controlled all major decisions. They had refused to share their technology with younger civilizations, and had used their power to enforce their will across the galaxy. Eventually, their own people had grown tired of the restrictions, and internal conflicts had destroyed them from within. The facilities had been abandoned and sealed as the last precursors died out, leaving behind only their technology and warnings about the dangers of inflexible systems. Jake returned to the control room and told Kira what he had found. She nodded slowly and said that the Council was repeating the same mistakes. They had created a hierarchy that resisted change, and they used their power to keep younger civilizations in subordinate positions. If humanity wanted to survive, they would need to show the galaxy that there was a better way to organize interstellar society. They worked for 8 hours downloading data and gathering devices before Kira announced that she had retrieved everything accessible from the facility. Jake ordered everyone back to the ship, and they sealed the airlocks behind them. As Horizon Runner undocked and began moving back toward the perimeter, the ancient facility's lights dimmed and went dark again, waiting for the next visitors who might arrive in another 1,000 years. The journey back through the defense grid was tense, because they were now carrying cargo that would make them the most valuable target in the galaxy. Every major power would want what they had found, and many would be willing to go to war to get it. Jake knew that their lives had just become much more complicated and dangerous. When they cleared the Forbidden Zone and jumped to faster-than-light travel, Jake called a crew meeting in the common area. He explained that they now possessed technology that could change the balance of power in the galaxy, but that this would make them targets for everyone, including the Council. He gave every crew member the option to leave when they reached the next station, and no one would think less of them for choosing safety over danger. Lisa was the first to speak, and she said that she had not joined the fleet to play it safe. Pete agreed, and added that he wanted to see what human engineers could do with precursor technology. The other crew members voiced similar sentiments, and Jake felt pride in the people who served under his command. They understood the risks, but they also understood that they were part of something that could give humanity a real future in the galaxy. Kira stood and addressed the crew directly. She told them that she had spent her life being told that her interests in science and knowledge were worthless compared to military glory. The Council had dismissed her as weak because she preferred learning to fighting. Now she had a chance to prove that knowledge was a form of power that could defeat even the mightiest armies. She thanked them for accepting her as part of their crew and promised that she would use everything she knew to help protect them and their people. The crew welcomed her words with applause, and Jake saw that Kira had truly become one of them. She was no longer just the unwanted princess who had been given away as an insult. She was a valued member of their team, and a symbol of what humans could achieve when they worked together with others who shared their values. News of humanity's raid on the Forbidden Zone spread through Council space faster than Jake had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, every major civilization knew that humans had violated the most sacred law in galactic politics and had stolen precursor technology. What made the situation worse, from the Council's perspective, was that they could not deny the humans had succeeded where everyone else had failed for 2 centuries. The defense grid that was supposed to be impenetrable had opened for a human ship guided by the king's own daughter. King Tharvos stood before the Galactic Council, demanding action against humanity and the return of his traitorous daughter. His scales flashed with colors that indicated rage and humiliation as he described how Kira had betrayed her entire species by helping primitive humans access technology they had no right to possess. Councillor Vrex supported the king's position and argued that humans needed to be taught a lesson before other young civilizations got similar ideas about challenging council authority. The council voted to form a coalition fleet that would travel to human space and force Earth to surrender both Kira and all precursor technology. 8 species contributed warships to the effort, creating a force of 300 vessels, ranging from small destroyers to massive dreadnoughts the size of cities. The fleet began assembling at a staging area near the border of human territory, and their presence was meant to intimidate humanity into immediate surrender. Jake had been promoted to admiral upon his return to Earth, and now commanded the defense of human space from an orbital command station above the planet. The promotion had come with enormous responsibility and very few resources because Earth's military was tiny compared to the forces arrayed against them. He had maybe 50 combat-capable ships and a few dozen stations that could serve as defensive positions. On paper, the situation was hopeless, and many officials argued for negotiating a surrender that might preserve Earth's independence, even if it meant giving up the technology. Kira worked beside Jake in the command center, analyzing the coalition fleet composition and predicting their likely strategies. She had spent her life studying military doctrine from every major civilization, and she understood how they would approach the battle. The coalition would expect humans to defend their core worlds, which meant fortifying Earth and the inner colonies with every available ship. They would bring overwhelming force to those defensive positions and crush the human fleet through superior numbers and firepower. Jake listened to her analysis and then asked the question that mattered most. What would the coalition not expect humans to do? Kira smiled, because she knew he was thinking the same way she was. Instead of defending fixed positions, humans needed to use their advantages, which were speed and maneuverability, and the shield vulnerability she had discovered. The coalition fleet was designed to fight conventional battles against opponents who used similar tactics. They were not prepared for an enemy who refused to fight on their terms. The strategy Jake proposed shocked the military leadership on Earth. He wanted to disperse human forces throughout their territory instead of concentrating them. Small squadrons of 3 to 5 ships would operate independently, hitting supply lines and support vessels, while avoiding direct confrontation with the main battle groups. The coalition would have to split their forces to chase down these squadrons, which would give humans opportunities to strike at weakened elements. It was asymmetric warfare applied to space combat, and it went against everything traditional military doctrine taught about fleet actions. Commander Helen Torres argued in favor of the plan during heated debates with other senior officers. She pointed out that humans had nothing to lose because they were going to lose a conventional battle anyway. At least this strategy gave them a chance to inflict enough damage that the coalition would reconsider the costs of continuing the war. After 3 days of argument, Earth's government approved Jake's strategy, and orders went out to all human vessels to begin dispersal operations. The coalition fleet entered human space, expecting to find defensive formations around major colonies. Instead, they found empty space and scattered patrol ships that fled before they could be engaged. Frustrated, coalition commanders began spreading their forces to search for the main human fleet. That was when Captain Megan Ross led her squadron in the first strike against a Zentarii supply convoy. 3 human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly among the convoy's support vessels and opened fire with railguns before the escorts could react. The kinetic projectiles punched through energy shields during their refresh cycles, exactly as Kira had predicted. 2 supply ships exploded, and a third was crippled before the human squadron jumped away. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes, and the Zentarii commanders could not believe what had happened. Their shields were supposed to be invulnerable, but the humans had destroyed 3 ships without taking any damage in return. Similar attacks began occurring throughout human space as other squadrons implemented the same tactics. Commander Lucas Brown hit a mining operation that was feeding raw materials to the coalition fleet. Captain Ethan Drake ambushed a patrol group in an asteroid field, destroying 4 ships before escaping. Each attack was small, but the cumulative effect was significant. The coalition was bleeding resources and ships without ever engaging the human main fleet, because there was no human main fleet to engage. King Tharvos demanded that his commanders find and destroy the human forces, but the coalition fleet was designed for large-scale battles, not guerrilla warfare. Their sensors were optimized for tracking major fleet movements, not small squadrons that used hit-and-run tactics. Their command structure was rigid and could not adapt quickly to changing situations. Every advantage they had in size and firepower was being neutralized by humans who refused to fight the way they were supposed to. The turning point came at Callisto Station, which was a critical supply depot near Jupiter. Commander Kate Phillips was ordered to hold the station with only 3 ships against a Zentarii battle group of 30 vessels. The odds were suicidal, but Kate understood that sometimes you had to make a stand to show your enemy that you would not back down. She positioned her ships in a defensive formation around the station and waited for the attack. The Zentarii commander assumed this would be an easy victory. He sent his ships forward in a standard assault formation, confident that overwhelming firepower would quickly destroy the human defenders. Kate waited until the enemy ships were committed to their approach, and then she sprung her trap. Her ships had been retrofitted with improved railgun systems based on precursor technology that increased their rate of fire by 300%. When they opened fire, the amount of kinetic projectiles filling space was devastating. The Zentarii shields could not handle the volume of fire, because the refresh cycle vulnerability meant that projectiles kept getting through. Ships began taking hits on their hulls, and critical systems started failing. The neat assault formation collapsed into chaos as captains tried to maneuver away from the unexpected firepower. Kate pressed her advantage, and her ships focused fire on the command vessel, destroying it with a sustained barrage that overwhelmed its defenses. Without their commander, the Zentarii battle group lost coordination, and Kate's ships tore through their formation. 15 Zentarii ships were destroyed, and another 10 were crippled by the time the survivors retreated. Kate had lost 1 ship and taken damage on the other 2, but she had held Callisto Station. More importantly, she had proven that humans could win against superior numbers when they used their advantages properly. News of the battle spread through both human and coalition forces. For humans, it was proof that they could fight and win. For the coalition, it was a shocking demonstration that their technological superiority did not guarantee victory. The war continued for 2 more months, with the coalition becoming increasingly frustrated by their inability to force a decisive battle. Their casualties mounted, while human losses remained relatively light. Back on their homeworlds, populations began questioning why they were losing ships and people to fight humans who had done nothing except defend themselves. Kira had been broadcasting messages directly to citizens of Council species, explaining the human perspective and calling for reform of the galactic system. Her words found audiences among young people and intellectuals who were tired of the rigid hierarchy that dominated galactic politics. 6 species withdrew from the coalition after protests erupted on their homeworlds. The economic cost of maintaining the war effort was straining military budgets, and many governments faced internal pressure to end the conflict. King Tharvos found himself increasingly isolated, as even his allies began questioning the wisdom of continuing the war. The galaxy was watching, and what they saw was a small civilization defending itself successfully against overwhelming force. The Council's image as invincible and just was crumbling. In a last desperate attempt to salvage victory and his reputation, King Tharvos ordered a direct assault on Earth with the remaining loyalist forces. He assembled 120 ships and planned a massive strike that would destroy Earth's orbital defenses and force humanity to surrender. The fleet would jump directly into Earth's solar system and overwhelm the defenders before they could respond. It was a plan driven by pride and anger rather than sound military strategy, but the king was beyond rational thinking. Jake received intelligence about the planned attack from sources within the coalition fleet. Some officers who disagreed with the war had begun secretly feeding information to human commanders. Jake knew this was the moment that would decide everything. If the coalition succeeded in destroying Earth, then humanity would have no choice but to surrender. If they could defeat this attack, then the war would effectively be over, because the Council would have no forces left to continue fighting. The coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system with King Tharvos expecting to find a desperate defensive formation around the human homeworld. Instead, they found something that shocked every commander in the attacking force. Waiting for them was a combined fleet of ships from multiple species arranged in a defensive line that stretched across space. Human vessels formed the core, but they were supported by ships from the Mirani, whose insectoid civilization had long been oppressed by council policies. The Yothre had sent medical vessels and support craft showing their solidarity with the human cause. Most shocking were the Zentari ships flying alongside the humans, because they were commanded by officers who had defected after hearing Kira's messages about reform and justice. Jake stood on the bridge of his command ship, broadcasting a message across all channels, so every member of the Coalition fleet could hear his words. He told King Tharvos that he had come to Earth expecting to punish humanity for daring to stand as equals with the Council. However, the king needed to look at the fleet arrayed against him because this was no longer just about humans defending their homeworld. This was about every species that was tired of being told their place in a system designed to benefit the powerful at the expense of everyone else. The galaxy was changing, and the old order that the Council represented was dying whether they acknowledged it or not. King Tharvos responded with rage, ordering his fleet to attack and destroy every ship opposing him. He screamed about traitors and betrayal, but his words rang hollow, because half his own people had abandoned his cause. The battle began with the Coalition fleet moving forward in a traditional assault formation that had won countless conflicts over the centuries. What they encountered was something completely different from any battle they had fought before. The human ships moved with coordination that seemed impossible given their small numbers. They used the precursor-enhanced technology that Jake's crew had brought back from the Forbidden Zone, and their weapons hit with devastating accuracy. The railguns that had once been considered primitive now fired projectiles that punched through shields and armor with equal ease. Kira had worked with human engineers to integrate precursor targeting systems with existing weapons, creating hybrid technology that combined the best of both approaches. The Mirani ships attacked from unexpected angles, using tactics that confused Coalition commanders who were used to fighting opponents that followed standard doctrine. The Yothre vessels hung back, providing medical support and electronic warfare that disrupted Coalition communications. The defected Zentari fought with particular intensity because they were defending not just humanity, but their own vision of a better future for their species. The Coalition fleet found itself fighting an enemy that refused to be predictable or follow the rules they expected. Captain Ethan Drake commanded Freedom's Call, the first human warship built entirely with precursor-enhanced systems. His ship tore through the Coalition line, targeting command vessels and destroying them before they could coordinate responses. Commander Lucas Brown led a squadron that specialized in close-range combat, using the chaos of battle to get inside the Coalition formation, where their larger ships could not maneuver effectively. Captain Megan Ross coordinated fighter craft that swarmed around Coalition dreadnoughts, attacking weak points and overwhelming point defense systems. The battle raged for 4 hours, with the Coalition fleet slowly being ground down by tactics they had no counter for. King Tharvos watched from his flagship as his forces fell apart around him. He ordered his personal guard to make a final push toward Earth, hoping to at least strike the human homeworld before his fleet was destroyed. Jake anticipated this move and positioned his strongest ships directly in the path of the king's advance. The resulting clash was brutal, with both sides taking heavy casualties. But the human defenders held their line. Lisa Monroe commanded one of the ships that faced the king's flagship directly. She coordinated her weapons fire with 2 other captains, creating a focused barrage that overwhelmed the flagship's defenses. Railgun projectiles hammered into the massive vessel's hull, causing critical systems to fail one by one. The flagship's shields collapsed under the sustained assault, and secondary explosions began tearing through its interior. King Tharvos had no choice but to order evacuation, as his ship died around him. With their king's flagship disabled, the remaining Coalition forces lost their will to fight. Ships began breaking off and retreating, while others simply surrendered where they were. Jake ordered his forces to allow retreating vessels to leave unmolested because he wanted to end the war, not create a massacre. The Battle of Earth was over, and humanity had won not just a military victory but something far more important. They had shown the galaxy that the Council's power was not absolute, and that change was possible. The aftermath of the battle brought enormous changes to galactic politics. The council chambers that had once been dominated by the same old voices now echoed with calls for reform from species that had found their courage watching humans fight. Kira addressed the full council assembly not as a disgraced princess, but as humanity's ambassador and representative of the reform coalition that had grown from the alliance of species that fought at Earth. She proposed radical changes to how the council operated, including term limits for council seats, so that power could not be held indefinitely by the same families and civilizations. She called for representation for younger civilizations that had previously been excluded from major decisions. She demanded open access to technologies that could benefit everyone, instead of being hoarded by the powerful. She spoke about the precursors and how their civilization had fallen because they created a rigid system that could not adapt to change. The council could learn from that failure, or they could repeat it and destroy themselves through their own inflexibility. The debate lasted for weeks, with conservative council members fighting to preserve their privileges, while reformers pushed for change. Public opinion across the galaxy strongly favored reform because billions of ordinary citizens had watched the war and seen that the old system was corrupt and unjust. In the end, the council voted to approve major reforms that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The vote was close, and many powerful interests opposed the changes. But enough council members recognized that refusing reform would lead to revolution. Humanity gained a permanent seat on the council, with full voting rights equal to any other species. Jake Sullivan was appointed as the first director of the Galactic Cooperative Defense Force, which was a new military organization designed to protect all member species equally, instead of serving the interests of the powerful. The forbidden zones were opened for regulated exploration with proper safety protocols, so that precursor technology could be studied and shared. Young civilizations received support and resources to help them develop instead of being exploited for cheap labor and raw materials. King Tharvos was forced to abdicate after his defeat, and the Zentarii Empire underwent its own internal reforms. He requested one final meeting with his daughter before he left public life, and Kira agreed to see him. They met in a private room without guards or witnesses, and the king looked old and tired in a way she had never seen before. He told her that she had destroyed everything he had built over his long life, and that history would remember him as a failure. Kira looked at her father and felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only sadness for the wasted years. She told him that she had not destroyed his empire, but rather had saved it from a fate worse than defeat. The Zentarii would survive and thrive as part of a larger cooperative system instead of collapsing under the weight of their own rigid traditions. She said that he had been so afraid of appearing weak that he had thrown away his greatest asset, which was her. His fear of change had made him blind to the fact that the galaxy was changing, whether he wanted it to or not. King Tharvos had no response to her words because deep down he knew she was right. He left the meeting and went into exile on a remote world where former council leaders were sent to live out their remaining years. The Zentarii people chose new leaders who embraced the reforms and worked to rebuild their species' reputation in the changed galaxy. Years passed, and the reforms took hold across civilized space. Trade flourished between species that had once viewed each other with suspicion. Technology sharing programs allowed younger civilizations to develop faster without having to reinvent everything. Cultural exchanges brought different species together in ways that had been impossible under the old rigid system. The galaxy was not perfect, and there were still conflicts and problems, but the overall trajectory was toward cooperation and mutual benefit. Jake and Kira stood together on the observation deck of Unity Station, which was the new headquarters for the Galactic Cooperative Defense Force. The station orbited in neutral space between major powers and served as a symbol of the new order they had helped create. Below them, ships from 100 different species moved through space lanes that had once been restricted by council regulations. Merchants and travelers and students all going about their lives in a galaxy that was more open and free than it had been in centuries. Kira asked Jake if he ever regretted accepting the arrangement that day in the council chambers when her father had offered her as an insult. Jake smiled and took her hand, telling her that it was the best command decision he had ever made. What the council had meant as humiliation had become the foundation for revolutionary change. Two people who had been dismissed and underestimated had found each other, and together they had changed the course of galactic history. They watched the ships below, and talked about the future. There was still much work to do, because changing a galactic civilization was the work of generations, not years. However, they had proven that change was possible, and that even the most powerful systems could be reformed when enough people demanded it. The galaxy had learned an important lesson, which was that the measure of a civilization was not its military power or its technological advancement, but rather its willingness to adapt and include everyone in the process of building a better future. Humanity had brought that lesson to the stars, and the stars would never be the same.